This is Exit Strategy Podcast, a podcast about geopolitics, conflict, and the illicit political economy with me, your host, Jody Ray. If you enjoy what I'm doing with this project, please consider becoming a Patreon at www.patreon.com/exitstrategyshow or with a one-time donation through Venmo at Exit Strategy Show. For the price of a couple cups of coffee each month, you will get early and unfettered access to not only this podcast, but also to Exit Strategy TV, a video exploration project that showcases hidden and unusual places where I personally cover the local culture, the conflict, and the cuisine. I would really appreciate your support. Please consider becoming a Patreon today. www.patreon.com/exitstrategyshow. Thank you so much for your support. Today I speak with James Barnett, a research fellow at Hudson Institute based in Lagos, Nigeria, where he studies conflict, terrorism, and geopolitics in Africa. He has worked extensively in conflict environments across Nigeria, studied and traveled widely in East Africa and the Middle East, and has reported from Ukraine during the 2022 Russian invasion. He's a research fellow with the Center for Democracy and Development in Abuja. And in 2021, he was a Fulbright research fellow at the University of Lagos for 9 months. Prior to joining his current position at Hudson, he has held research and analyst positions with the United States Institute of Peace, the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, and the American Enterprise Institute's Critical Threats Project. His writing has appeared in publications such as Foreign Policy, New Lines Magazine, War on the Rocks, African Argument, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. We talk about African geopolitics, regional security, conflict in West Africa, the threat of ISIS in the West African provinces, and his time interviewing bandits that are active in the north of Nigeria. He's got a fantastic article about his experience interviewing some of the main actors in some of this political violence, and I'll leave those in the show notes. I hope you enjoy this conversation. This is my conversation with James Barnett. Thank you so much for listening. Mr. James Barnett, thank you so much for joining the show today. We've been playing a bit of phone tag and email tag. I'm happy to finally get a hold of you. I've been wanting to talk to you for some time.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jody. And yeah, sorry about the
no, of course, no
being incommunicado for a bit. Yeah,
no apologies necessary. You are based in Lagos, Nigeria. I know you are Fulbright visiting fellow at the Institute of American and Diaspora Studies at the University of Lagos. But yeah, writer, researcher, journalist. What title do you go by when you're at a cocktail party?
Yeah, good question. It's African and Diaspora Studies, by the way. Sorry, not American. Just
did I say American?
That out.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, American.
Sorry about that.
I think they do want to create an Institute of American Studies, possibly at Unilag. So maybe in the future. Yeah, so I have a couple affiliations. My Fulbright ended last year, but I was still working with the University of Lagos this year.
Cool.
I essentially say I'm a researcher, journalist, and consultant based in Nigeria, and I work with a variety of some Nigerian organizations, some international organizations. I'm also a part-time think tanker. I'm a non-resident fellow at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. So if it's a D.C. cocktail party, that's probably how I'd lead off, speaking a language they understand.
Of course. But the major focus of your research and writing is in conflict, especially in East Africa, or excuse me, well, I guess Africa. You tell me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, thanks. Yeah, I'd say, conflict and kind of, geopolitics. And I mean, my interests have kind of varied over the years. One of the benefits of being freelance is that you can kind of dip into different stuff. But I'd say, certainly the past going on, close to 2 years now, essentially, since I've been based in Nigeria, the main kind of locus of my research has been on conflict and also military history here in Nigeria. But I also have a background in East Africa, parts of the Middle East, and I do some work there, and actually probably looking to kind of be going to do maybe some field work kind of in those regions in the not so distant future. But for now, Nigeria has kind of been the focus for the past 18 months or so.
Okay, interesting. I wanted to get into some of the details of your research, but I wanted to I guess, set the stage for some of the listeners, because I always ask guests, what sparked their interest in geopolitics? How did you get started in this? What were the early days like? Tell me about how you got interested in geopolitics, conflict, basically everything this podcast is about, and what the listeners that listen to this podcast certainly want to hear.
Yeah, great. No, that's I guess take you on my personal journey, or maybe I should start with 1648 and Westphalia and all of that. No, I mean to keep it brief, I guess I think like probably a lot of listeners here, right? I as a kid, as a young boy, I became very interested in kind of military history. I think one of the first grown-up books I read, I remember it was like an elementary school. My mom was complaining that I was still I was in third grade, I think, and I was still reading Captain Underpants or stuff. She's like, "Hey, you should try for some more advanced books or whatever." And so that day I saw at a bookshelf, I saw a really cool book with a red tank on it. And I was like, okay, I'm going to buy this. And it was Tom Clancy's Red Storm Rising, 1,000 pages or whatever. And I think my parents didn't think I'd read it, but I plowed my way through it, and I didn't understand a lot of it. But that kind of sparked an interest vaguely in, military stuff. So I guess, yeah, maybe it's all aesthetics, right? If it started with a picture of a cool tank. Sure. So something in the prepubescent male's gene, just kind of, we gravitate towards that stuff. But no, I mean, more seriously, I became really interested. I'd say by middle school, I kind of, through a number of, or for a number of reasons, kind of developed just like a real passion for military history, and particularly World War II. I mean, I think sure. Right, a lot of us, it's like we were either World War II guys or Civil War guys or Revolutionary War guys, and then you get older and your interests become more niche. You become a War of Austrian Succession guy or whatever. But for me, it was definitely World War II that kind of sparked my interest. And so that, from there, I kind of just became very interested in history broadly, ancient history, modern history, a lot of kind of military science, military studies. And yeah, by the time I got to university, I was kind of interested in pursuing a career in either the military or kind of the national security space. And, I'd also, kind of separately, I'd always really liked languages. And so I started studying Arabic in college. A lot of people who were interested in going into the kind of foreign policy and NatSec space were studying Arabic. I went to the University of Texas, which had a very good program. But kind of, over the years, my interests, kind of changed a bit throughout college, and then, spent some years in DC kind of working more in the policy space, and decided I didn't want to go into government, kind of at least not right away. And so a few years ago, I decided to go freelance, and COVID kind of interrupted that in a relatively dramatic way. But eventually, I made my way out of the States, and so I've been spending the past kind of year and a half looking at the different permutations of conflict and insecurity here in Nigeria, kind of West Africa broadly, and some other regions as well. So hope that makes sense. As I mentioned to you before the show, I have a bit of I'm recovering from a bit of malaria. So if I go off onto delirious tangents, we know who to blame.
It's all good. I hope you get well soon. Yeah, I know it's certainly something to deal with. I just got back from Togo and Benin in April, May. Yeah, and while no malaria, we certainly became ill there, but that's for another conversation. So okay, I hope you get well soon. Tell me about the type of conflict that you've been researching. What's the latest, or I guess bring us into a bit of I want to get into the conversation where you were get into the conversation with some details around the type of research you're doing with regard to conflict in those regions, maybe between West and East Africa. Might be interesting. And then also segue into kind of how I came upon you. I believe I found you on Twitter and started reading some of your articles in foreign policy and stuff. But you actually interviewed some of these non-state actors, some of the bandits, some of the kidnappers, some of the infamous people surrounding, like Boko Haram, which has transformed into other sorts of forces. But I'm speaking as a layman, and the reason I'm having you on is because I want to learn more. Everybody wants to learn more about this. So that's a big, broad ask, but if you kind of know where I'm going, let's do that.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. So I kind of, in terms of my initial research on East Africa, so I spent a year in East Africa after graduating college. I was in Tanzania, studied Swahili, traveled around the region a bit, and kind of when I got to DC and I landed in the kind of think tank space and was doing some, freelance writing for magazines and stuff. I was, I'm really interested in the whole region and kind of had trouble staying focused on one issue. And also, had kind of the problem of being a relatively young analyst, not based in the region. And so one of the things that I found was kind of where there was some interest in DC and stuff, and kind of where my jobs took me was looking into, mostly looking at kind of jihadist insurgency in East Africa. And so that kind of combined a bit of my background in Arabic, and then looking at, my time in East Africa. And so I spent a lot of time looking at like the Al-Shabaab insurgency based in Somalia, but, kind of has spread into several countries. Did a bit of work on the Mideast as well, but I was kind of more broadly interested in conflict writ large, and then also the very kind of significant kind of geopolitical developments that have been happening in the Horn of Africa, particularly over the past few years, with kind of growing competition between different actors, the Gulf states, Turkey, China, Russia, all that stuff. So, the region, that's the whole massive region, and I really haven't had the time or kind of the bandwidth to focus too in depth on that. But I ended up getting some pretty interesting kind of some interesting work looking at those different aspects in East Africa. When I came to Nigeria, my Fulbright research grant was actually, my proposal was to look at Nigerian military history. So Nigeria, from its independence in 1960 until 1999, was largely ruled by successive military regimes. There were 3 interludes of civilian rule, but for the most part, those years, nearly 4 decades of military rule. And so I was looking particularly at the last decade of military rule, the 1990s, the military rulers, Ibrahim Babangida and then Sani Abacha, and looking at the kind of Nigerian military's performance in the this kind of regional peacekeeping initiative in the Liberian and Sierra Leonean civil wars in the 1990s. So it's essentially kind of like military history, looking at different aspects of how kind of the politicization of the military affected its battlefield performance, in expeditionary missions and such. But the great thing about a Fulbright research grant, if anyone listening is interested in applying, is that they give you quite a lot of freedom. It depends, of course, on the country you go to, the institute your host institution and stuff. But I kind of knew coming into when I got to Lagos, the University of Lagos, that I was also very interested in some of the kind of contemporary security challenges bedeviling Nigeria. And the one that I'd looked at the most was the Boko Haram insurgency, because, again, my background had kind of been studying jihadist movements in Africa. There had been a good amount of literature about the Boko Haram insurgency, its origins and stuff. There's still a lot that we don't know. There's actually a lot that's kind of shrouded in mystery still about the group, but there's been a pretty good body of literature that I'd kind of been read up on. So I thought, okay, now I'm in the country, it'd be interesting to kind of do some research on that. But, the unfortunate fact of the matter is that, Nigeria today is suffering from kind of many myriad forms of conflict, insurgency, and heavy criminal violence that essentially kind of has morphed into insurgency in some ways. And the truth is the Boko Haram conflict, while absolutely devastating, it sometimes kind of at least in the international press, it kind of overshadows some of the other forms of insecurity in Nigeria, because, it's a jihadist actor, which since 9/11, of course, the Western press and Western public has been, very concerned about. Now one of the strongest faction of Boko Haram is an official Islamic State province. So there's kind of that transnational or international dimension. But in reality, the conflict that has actually probably been the most bloody in Nigeria in recent years, certainly at least if you're looking at how civilians have been impacted, has been this very complex conflict up in northwestern Nigeria that kind of started as a form of intercommunal, kind of highly ethnicized farmer-herder conflict that has kind of spurned into this broader issue of, this broader term of banditry, or now it's often referred to as banditry terrorism. And so essentially you have these heavily armed criminal gangs, sometimes hundreds, even up to 1,000 in number, that are kind of that are terrorizing large parts of northwestern Nigeria, particularly the rural areas, but increasingly also striking in kind of urban areas and hitting even critical infrastructure. And these bandits kind of, on the surface, actually, a lot of kind of commentators, both in Nigeria and outside Nigeria, were kind of suspecting that the bandits were to some extent an offshoot of the Boko Haram crisis, because essentially, I think part of it was just that people, look at how violent these are. You hear these reports, 100 people massacred in a village, 200, 300 students abducted from a school, and particularly, the issue of school kidnapping, school abductions. That's something that Boko Haram kind of first made famous as a tactic, about starting in 2014 with the abduction of the Chibok girls. So there was, a lot of people, I think, within Nigeria and without, not without good reason, we're kind of looking at this and saying, oh, who are these bandits, right? Are these guys really just bandits? I mean, this seems to be this really bloody conflict, but there's not a lot of explanation of what's going on. And so that kind of, last year during my Fulbright year, that ended up being kind of one of the big, the big focus of my research was looking at banditry. And then also, I did some work in northeastern Nigeria, kind of the heart of the Boko Haram conflict. So I did some research up there, and one of the kind of, the studies that I produced out of this, along with two of my colleagues, looked at the kind of the intersection of Boko Haram and the bandits. And we actually found, kind of contrary to, I think, the conventional wisdom, that these two conflicts, not only are they quite distinct, but actually there hasn't been kind of the degree of convergence or confluence between these criminal bandit, militant actors and the Boko Haram jihadists, to use kind of the broad generic term for Nigerian jihadists. This year I've also kind of shifted into a couple other parts of Nigeria to do a bit of research on how this is all kind of related. The thing with Nigeria is it's not right, like it's not so simple as, okay, it's Boko Haram in the northeast, bandits in the northwest, farmer-herder violence in the north central, and like in the southern regions, it's piracy and oil theft, and then in the southeast, it's kind of secessionist violence. Like, I mean, that's kind of the 30,000-foot overview. I use that kind of explanation at times to describe how kind of each region of Nigeria has its own unique problems. But in reality, these issues do overlap. Militants move from one area to another. Sometimes the kind of the nature of militancy might differ from one region to another, but it has very similar root causes. So this year I've been working a bit on kind of trying to, doing some field work in different parts of the country, trying to get a sense of how these local conflicts look and stuff, and to what extent are they connected, if not necessarily connected by the same set of actors, then kind of the same, causes and dynamics and such. So that's kind of an overview of my general work. Can ask more.
Sure, no, I appreciate it. There's a lot I want to ask you. So what does the north of Nigeria look like today? I mean, I've had the opportunity to interview a gentleman in the Nigerian Special Forces. I'm not sure if you're familiar. He's active on Instagram, Abubakar Afan. And he's kind of alluded to the fact that he views the conflict in the north, especially with regard to Boko Haram, as pretty much all but dead, and this is transferred into what they consider, ISIS in the West African provinces. Is that correct way to view things?
I mean, I wouldn't say the conflict in the Northeast is dead. I agree that the stronger group now is this ISIS West Africa province, this ISWAP. Right. But I think that the conflict's been going on there for what, 13 years now, right? The arms, I mean, that's, continuously for 13 years, since 2009. The original Boko Haram, so Boko Haram kind of went through several splinterings throughout its history. First there was an offshoot in around the period of 2012 and 2013, called Ansaru, that was kind of, backed by Al-Qaeda, particularly Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. They were, somewhat operational and kind of more so in north central and northwestern Nigeria for a few years. And then they kind of were rolled up by the security forces, went dormant, and we're now seeing that they're starting to reactivate a bit. Though actually, my own theory about Ansaru is that there's kind of what we have now is a very different Ansaru than the original one. I'm happy to go into detail about that, though it's a bit in the weeds. But the main splintering of Boko Haram occurred around 2015, 2016. Where kind of after reaching its zenith, right, Boko Haram expanded very rapidly, under the leadership of this, the brutal Abu Bakr Shekau. And they expanded very rapidly without kind of, I think, frankly, much of a plan for kind of governance or for actually kind of controlling these territories, and Shekau was famously his concept, his interpretation of takfir, this idea of excommunicating fellow Muslims was so radical, even more radical than the standards of most jihadist groups, that he kind of they didn't do that much to kind of build any sort of basis of political legitimacy in a way that an insurgency would typically try to do. And so kind of after expanding, beginning in 2015, they got rolled back pretty heavily by a regional kind of multinational military initiative, led by the Nigerians, but with support from several other neighboring countries, and also kind of most famously, perhaps, some South African mercenaries. So, as Boko Haram was, kind of getting the shit kicked out of it, for lack of a better word, in the 2015, 2016 period, that's when you had this split with, essentially you had a number of commanders in Boko Haram who had kind of long been a bit skeptical of, Shekau, or at least, now that the how should I say, now that the movement was losing momentum, they were, their skepticism of Shekau's leadership was growing. And at the same time, the Islamic State, having reached its kind of territorial peak in the northeast, in Iraq and Syria, was looking for kind of partner jihadist organizations, around the globe, and saw Boko Haram in Africa. And so the Islamic State was kind of starting to provide a degree of kind of support, initially more kind of like a strategic guidance and theological guidance, and then eventually even, sending some money, sending some trainers into the region. But essentially these guys decided to split from Shekau and eventually got the Islamic State's backing. The Islamic State decided that Shekau was kind of too erratic, and in some ways, too extreme maybe is kind of one, maybe it's a bit misleading there, because the Islamic State is quite extreme, but in the sense that, the Shekau's kind of just not making any effort at really trying to win any political legitimacy from the area, within the areas that he controlled. So essentially that's how ISWAP formed. I mean, it's a bit more complicated, because technically Boko Haram became ISWAP while Shekau was still leader. But when this breakaway faction left, the Islamic State, after trying to kind of merge the two, or trying to reconcile the two, essentially when that failed, they threw their weight behind this breakaway faction. So that's how you have ISWAP. And yeah, I mean, I think over the past 6 years or so, ISWAP, it's ebbed and flowed, but I think on the whole, they're pretty powerful. I think they have suffered some real losses in the Northeast. They've kind of adopted, to the Nigerian military, and to some extent in these clashes with the remaining, Boko Haram faction. ISWAP killed Abu Bakr Shekau last year, so that's they kind of emerged triumphant in this struggle between the two factions, and the Boko Haram movement now a bit. It's kind of difficult to see kind of what the leadership is like, and kind of how widespread they are, or what their strength is. But I mean, my own view, my own assessment, and I've kind of changed it at points over the past year or so, because I think that there have been periods where ISWAP has really taken some losses. But I think on the whole, the movement is actually relatively strong. I think, they're trying to expand outside of the Northeast, which I think they've probably been trying to do for a couple of years. Recruiting, you're kind of trying to co-opt these other jihadist networks. They recently claimed credit for a big jailbreak in Abuja. That was in July, where they boosted, hundreds of people, but namely these kind of, I think it was 64 kind of Boko Haram, terrorist suspects. And, even though not all of those guys necessarily joined ISWAP, it's still kind of a big propaganda victory for them. So, I'm generally kind of concerned about the trends in the North. But, I do add the caveat, right, for people who are not familiar with Nigeria, that like there are different degrees of challenges stuff. And I am someone who I think tries to remind people that, like, if you're just looking at the jihadist angle, right, it's easy to look at ISWAP and be like, oh my God, right, they're claiming all these attacks, all that stuff. But the fact of the matter is Nigeria is a very big country. And unfortunately, there are many challenges besides ISWAP. And, there are also, plenty of parts of Nigeria that are not, anyways. But, my point being that ISWAP is not, Nigeria's situation is not similar to, say, Somalia's or like Afghanistan's pre-Taliban takeover, right? Sure. So we're not talking about like a very weak government or, essentially a non-existent state and a very massive, singular, kind of relatively unified insurgent group. What we have in Nigeria is kind of a state that's kind of gradually demonstrating less and less capacity, it seems, in many critical areas, and losing sovereignty in different parts of the country to different actors. And I think that's what kind of, to bring it back to the bandits, that was one of the things that really kind of interested me, but also, is of course so disturbing about what's been happening in the Northwest, which is that in some way, in the Northwest, the bandits have actually been kind of, they're in some ways they're more powerful, at least if you look at them as a unified whole. But of course, they're not a unified whole. They're gangs and they fight each other a lot. But just in the sense that the bandits have managed to take over, effectively kind of exercise some form of de facto sovereignty over such large swaths of northwestern and parts of north central Nigeria. And they kind of it without ever having the same degree of unity or the same kind of strong, cohering ideological kind of motivations as, say, the jihadist groups. And so in some ways, I think that the fact that kind of banditry has morphed into an intercommunal conflict has morphed into this kind of brutal war and frankly, a form of warlordism in the Northwest. I think in some ways that's the bleaker sign. If you're looking at kind of how Nigeria is going today, that's kind of one of the most upsetting kind of indicators of the relative, kind of the travails of the Nigerian state, if you will, that these people who never really even kind of, I think, set out to be as powerful as they've become, that they've kind of achieved this level of kind of influence and notoriety, and in the process, killed a tremendous number of people.
Right. I wanted to ask specifically, like, who makes up these bandits, and I guess how are they characterized and distinguished from those jihadist group? It doesn't seem like they have a religious motivation. For example, they're kidnapping for ransom. They're cattle rustling, so they're stealing cattle or trading cattle on the illicit economy. They're conducting terrorist-like violence. I think that's how you've described it before. Is this the same as the sort of banditry that's happening in North Kenya? I guess the first question is that correct way to understand them? Are they distinguished away from the jihadist groups as they have more of an economic grievance rather than a religious one, or they have no religious ideology so much? And I guess I'm curious about the comparison to what's happening in the north of Kenya.
Yeah, that's a great question. The northeastern Kenya also, you have some kind of similar instances or incidents in like Karamoja and Uganda, parts of South Sudan. So there are, from as I understand it, there are definitely some parallels. I've started reading a bit more about that East Africa stuff, and actually, that's a research project I'd really like to kind of to do at some point, is some sort of comparative study. But essentially, yeah, like the bandits, they're not. There's a whole kind of narrative around banditry and stuff in Nigeria that this is kind of an extension of the Boko Haram conflict, that they're motivated by these, radical religious ideology. I'm very much of the belief, having done a lot of this kind of intense field work in the Northwest, that the bandits there, at least, that religion is really not at the forefront of their minds. One of the challenges is that, like, the term bandit is so loose, right?
Sure.
I've started doing a bit more historical research, and like you look at how the term is used in Nigeria throughout the years, like there have been bandits in all parts of the country from all different ethnic groups, religious groups, right? I've started doing a bit more work in the Niger Delta region where you have piracy, and one of my colleagues down there, when we were chatting, he was like, what's the difference between a bandit and a pirate, right? A pirate is just a sea bandit. We have our bandits down here. So it's like there's lots of kind of interesting conceptual stuff there. But essentially, like, when the focus of my research has been in kind of a few key Northwestern states, though I've started to do a bit more in kind of the central regions this year, where things get a bit murkier in some ways, the definitions, because you have different kind of longstanding intercommunal conflicts, and the recent rise in banditry or kidnapping kind of maps onto those in different ways. I'll have a study I can talk more about that I'll, happy to plug, that will Sure. eventually be forthcoming on that. But in terms of Northwestern Nigeria, the bandits are essentially, it's, they come primarily from from one subset, one community, the pastoralist subset of the Fulani ethnic group. So they're primarily herdsmen. And essentially, the way I often describe banditry, to kind of simplify it, is throughout the 2000s and 2010s, you have kind of two parallel processes, which is, on the one hand, you have growing farmer-herder conflict between farming and herding communities in the Northwest. And increasingly, that conflict becomes ethnicized, even though in reality, the lines aren't so clear-cut, right? So there are plenty of non-Fulani who herd cattle. So the main ethnic groups we're talking about, at least in states like Zamfara, Sokoto, Katsina, it's Hausa and Fulani. And so it's not only Fulani who herd cattle, some Hausa herd cattle, and also plenty of Fulani are farmers or tradesmen, right? They're not involved in cattle rearing at all, though traditionally the Fulani ethnic group is a nomadic one that, or a largely nomadic one that, has been involved in transhumance and pastoralism. And so that reputation, has kind of set in. And so essentially you have conflicts between farmers and herders that are rooted in, that are kind of exacerbated by a lot of factors. People talk a lot about, climate change, environmental degradation. That was absolutely, has been a major factor, but it's also a very political issue. Nigeria after 1999, with the onset of democracy, you have new political actors entering the fore. You have more, new sources of political patronage being distributed, and it's happening in a very corrupt manner. You have these very cutthroat, bloody elections that are very high stakes because of the patronage involved. And so essentially, to kind of gloss over it very simply, you have this kind of these various political, economic, social, ecological factors creating tension between farmers and herders, driving more instances of confrontation, exacerbated by corruption and an inadequate justice system, which leads to a lot of tit-for-tat mobilization, essentially, right? People taking up arms to defend themselves and their fellow herders or fellow farmers because they don't believe the government will do a good or a fair job of dispensing justice. And so that's how kind of this conflict starts to take on ethnic lines, ethnic dimensions, or I should say greater ethnic dimensions. Then at the same time, so that's one process. Then in tandem, you have, criminal violence, and particularly cattle rustling, which has always been a feature of Northwestern Nigeria, right? I mean, if to be a bit, maybe simplistic, but also to kind of use an analogy that some listeners might appreciate, like the Northwest has kind of always been a frontier region, right? The borders have always been very porous. It's a primarily rural region. And so you have a lot of these, caravan routes that stretch across West Africa, that stretch across the Sahara. And so much like in, say, the American West or, the Spanish Plains or whatever, you have a degree of cattle rustling and banditry that's kind of always existed in those regions. But in the past, it's been, it's very, like what we have today is very different than that kind of historical banditry and forms of cattle rustling. But essentially what happens is that as this kind of ethnic tension is brewing, you have on the one hand, the cattle rustling gangs who are, many of them are comprised of Fulani, and traditionally cattle rustling had largely been this is a bit of a simplification, but traditionally it had largely been kind of an intra-Fulani affair, right? Like it's a bandit or something from the Fulani group stealing from another, Fulani kinsman, because that's where the cattle are, right? That's just what the economic logic kind of what it drives towards. You certainly had non-Fulani bandits as well. I don't want to, gloss over that, but sure. Kind of broadly speaking, this had been more of kind of a problem within, the pastoralist communities. But as this ethnic tension grows, you have these gangsters, these criminals, these cattle rustlers, essentially realizing that this is an opportunity to expand their operations and to expand their gangs. And so they start recruiting a lot of Fulani youths who are aggrieved because of this ethnic conflict and say, join my gang, we can promise you, wives, wealth, revenge, a sense of meaning, a sense of dignity, right? Your dignity has been assaulted. And so, and in many instances, also the bandits forcefully conscript people, and they'll do it under the guise of ethnic solidarity, but it was not always it's certainly not always been a voluntary process. In many instances, these cattle rustlers essentially just conscript people into their gangs. So at the one hand, you have these kind of criminal gangs that are just growing in strength as a result of the ethnic conflict, and then on the other hand, you have a lot of herders who are kind of taking up arms out of self-defense or out of legitimate grievances against the state. But what happens is that over time, these two kind of subsets, like, right, if you want to call one like an ethnic militia and the other a criminal gang, they kind of merge together. Because essentially when it gets to be the point that, okay, if you're a Fulani herder, you can't even bring your cattle into market in most towns because the local House of Vigilante are going to murder you because they think you're a bandit because you're Fulani. Then you're going to keep your cattle in the bush. You're going to stay out of the towns, right? You're going to live in the bush, so to speak. And if you live in the bush, it's a very hostile area. And so you need to have weapons to defend yourselves from other cattle rustlers or from House of Vigilantes who are going to ethnically profile you. And, once you do that, once you start accruing weapons, it's kind of only it's in some ways kind of a natural transformation, if you will, from I have these weapons for my legitimate self-defense to, well, while I have these weapons, I need to maintain, my community. I need to look after my community. Maybe I should use these to rob some, to loot some local villages or to rob some other gangs. And so you kind of have this melding, if you will, of, criminals presenting themselves as ethnic freedom fighters, and then kind of the leaders of ethnic militias kind of devolving into criminality in order to kind of sustain themselves in the bush. And also just, perhaps because it becomes an appealing mindset or an appealing lifestyle. The caveat I use to all of this is that, like, at the end of the day, when it comes to talking about motivations, like, who knows to some extent, right? I can't get into these people's minds. Like, of course, on one occasion I had this, incredibly rare exclusive interview with some of these guys. But even, several of there have only been a few kind of Nigerian journalists or researchers who have done this similar work. And, we chat a lot about this, and even them at a certain point, it's like, who knows what's going on in the head of this guy at a certain point, right? It's the other thing to keep in mind is that this conflict has been going on for so long, and it's become so violent that there's kind of an internal logic of warlordism, of gang warfare, that I think kind of is having an impact in terms of, what drives these bandits. I think, I read a number of studies from Latin America looking at youths and, MS-13 or these different, Barrio 18, all these different groups. And like, it's important, I guess, without maybe exoticizing it too much, it's important to recognize that, this kind of, it becomes a lifestyle, right? And so this militancy, this criminality, it can kind of develop its own logic, of its own internal logic that might seem somewhat inscrutable to outsiders. And especially as you have, the conflict has gone on for years, you have a younger generation of bandits who have been fighting since they were kids. That's I mean, that's the most fucked up part, but that's it, right? Like,
Sure.
And so it just becomes, yeah, I mean, it becomes this thing where even older bandits now will sometimes say, these younger bandits, they don't have any, they don't, I mean, it's like an episode of The Sopranos almost, right? These younger bandits, they don't respect the traditions, the rules. We don't know what's motivating them. They're impulsive, all this stuff, how much of that is sincere reflection versus cynical, effort to paint themselves as a more restrained type of militant. But anyways, I realize I've gone on a tangent.
No, it's okay.
It's one of those questions.
It's fascinating. It's quite interesting. I mean, you can have a whole podcast just dedicated to this one topic and go for hours. Yeah, let's talk about the Access interview that you alluded to. So I wanted to get into that. It seems like it was it's incredibly interesting. How did you begin to plan to, I guess, get on the ground and visit? I don't want to call them bandits. I don't want to dehumanize them in this sense, but this group of people. Can you tell me about the planning of it? How did you get access? And then, if you can, like, describe the day. Did you just get into a 4x4 with a driver and an armed gun and go and give them some money and stuff and get an interview? How did this all work?
Yeah, I mean, what I would say, I would plug my piece, right, that I wrote for New Lines, because frankly, that details everything. I mean, I don't really, that explains kind of what happened. I mean, to put it simply, for answer, no, we did not pay them. That's absolutely not. That was not I mean, the simple answer is that this came together very quickly.
Okay.
I think I'll say that. I did not go out setting to. I'd been working in the Northwest for a while. I'd interviewed lots of the bandits victims. I'd interviewed these local vigilantes. I'd interviewed government officials, security officials. By that point, I'd been in Zamfara State for maybe a week or so doing some field work, interviewing these different actors. And essentially an intermediary offered a colleague and I to meet some of these guys. And, it was, I think the calculation I made in my mind was, well, this would be a first. The bandits, I think, realized that there hadn't been a foreigner, they hadn't gotten an interview with a foreigner before. They'd been a very kind of shadowy group. And so it would hopefully be more in their interest to grant me an interview than to kidnap me. But the truth of the matter is, if I'd had more time to think about it, I probably wouldn't have done it. It was very risky, and it was, and you can't predict how things are going to turn out. You can't plan, once you do that, you're in their control. You're not in control of the situation. And, the other thing about the bandits, I described this in the article, but it was essentially three warlords. It was three different gang leaders who kind of brought some of their boys and rendezvoused and met up for this interview. And, they had a very, they spoke very freely. I mean, it was an incredibly eye-opening day, like I write about in the article. But it just as easily, something could have gone wrong. So it's, it came together very quickly. I did not go to Zamfara expecting or planning to interview bandits. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the actual transport, I mean, I describe it in the article, travel on a car for a while on the main road, you get off into smaller roads. And then, it's essentially we met up in the bush, but there are all these various communities where the bandits exercise kind of effective authority, these small villages and such. And so, we were told to meet in one of these communities. And then from there, they sent some boys on bike. One of the things that I thought was very interesting that I noted in the article was that, the boys, when they came on bike to pick us up, they were unarmed. And so they came into the community, they were walking around freely and stuff. But then about, 5-10 minutes after leaving this community or so, they pull over into a bush and they have their other friends waiting there who hand their guns to them. And so it was this kind of, stuff like that, during the day that I saw, kind of not just the interviews, but also just kind of seeing how these militants kind of operate in different ways and, stuff like that, right? Okay, they're leaving their guns in the bush. Is that a sign of respect, or is it kind of them like, is it a sign of power? And it's probably a bit of both, right? It's their way of saying, oh, we're not terrorizing this community, but it's also their way of saying, you know, we don't need to have guns here, right? Because who would challenge us, etc. So yeah, I mean, it was yeah, it was quite an experience. You know, I felt like I learned a lot that day. It was a challenging day. It was a stressful day in many ways, but you know, the truth of the matter is that just the Northwest is very unpredictable. And it, you know, I had been very concerned about even just traveling to that state in the first place because there are so many attacks on the road and such. And so the you know, kind of just planning to do field work in the Northwest was very complicated and stressful. And you know, it's even, you know, setting aside this one day where I had this one interview, you know, it's unfortunately the situation's become quite unpredictable. I mean, some areas are of course much safer than others, but I think it's one of the challenges that researchers and journalists have kind of operating in that area is the volatility of the conflict makes it very difficult to kind of plan you know, field work and stuff.
Sure.
There are, of course, lots of considerations you have to have, you know, both for your own safety, but especially for the safety of those around you. When you're a foreigner, you know, you stand out more. And so that's something that's, you know, been one of the major factors about where I do and don't go for field work, you know. And then you know, I mean, this could have a whole nother podcast episode, but the Nigerian government is not, has not encouraged people to kind of report on this conflict necessarily, particularly some of the recent issues of these two documentaries on banditry. The government threatened to sanction, and in one case did sanction the producer of that. So there's also kind of this angle of the government trying to chill, you know, chill the atmosphere, if you will, kind of silence some of the
documentaries
reporting and research. So there's one by BBC, both by good friends. So there was one earlier in the year by Trust TV. That's the daily Trust newspaper organization. So it's a Nigerian organization. And then another by BBC that came out, I believe, in March, early March, early March. And then in July, a BBC documentary, BBC Africa Eye, was published as well. I highly encourage everyone to watch both of them. The work of two really incredible journalists, Yusuf Anka in the case of BBC and Abdulaziz in the case of Trust TV. People who, you know, I'm very pleased to call colleagues, and I just kind of really look up to them because they, you know, I did this once, and they've, you know, I mean, we've all done a lot of work in the Northwest, but I think especially they can kind of bring a perspective to it, you know, being people from this region and stuff, and just the amount of footwork and effort that went into it, I think is really admirable. So I've been, you know, trying to plug those whenever I can, worth seeing.
I'll put them in the show notes for sure.
Yeah, please do. Still read my article as well.
No, absolutely. I'll throw that in there as well. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
100%.
And there's just, I mean, there's value. I sent both these documentaries to my friends and family when they came out, because it was like, look, you know, I mean, I'm a fan of the spoken word, you know, old school journalism. I like long form stuff, but you know, capturing it on camera is something else. And really, you know, I get chills watching those because it reminds me of these places, and some of the stories are just so poignant. But yes, so yeah, please check those out.
No, absolutely. I appreciate it. I know we're about at time here, so I want to give you an opportunity to let listeners know where we can follow your work. If you want to give us your social media, Twitter, all that good stuff, please, let us know where we could follow you.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Jody. Twitter is probably the best spot, at JH_Barnett. I go through my tweeting is very much of ebbs and flows. So, you know, I go through periods where I don't tweet much, and then periods where I tweet far too much and don't get anything done. But yeah, so you can look for it there. You know, I will have a couple, like I said, I've been doing some work in kind of different parts of Nigeria this year. One of the kind of overarching themes of that work is looking at how, to some extent, how these conflicts are interconnected, but also kind of the narratives that emerge from these conflicts, right? Kind of how Nigerians or foreign observers, you know, as well, kind of refer to different militants or different types of militancy or different types of criminality based on the local context, and how that kind of feeds certain narratives. on the national level. We're heading into an election in February 2023, so kind of politics is at the forefront of everyone's minds, and so the insecurity itself it's both, it's a big political topic, but it's also, that of course means that there's a lot of politicization of insecurity. Politicians sometimes using some very dangerous inflammatory rhetoric and such in order to advance their political agenda. So we're in for what I think are going to be a very turbulent few months in Nigeria. And I hope that some of, my upcoming works and stuff will shed some light on some of these issues. And then, like I said, possibly moving moving back to another side of the continent next year. So, Twitter is the best place to follow me. I don't think I've updated my LinkedIn in like a year or so. So that's actually
good.
It's a good memory. That I should probably do that. But don't add me on LinkedIn. It won't do me any good.
Okay, nobody add James on LinkedIn. We heard it here first. No, hey, there's a lot to learn. It's been fantastic to talk to you. I'm happy that we finally got to talk, and I'm happy to have you back on to talk about additional things that are where we can get into even more detail. But it was great to talk to you this morning, and I hope you get well soon. And we'll follow you on Twitter.
Thanks.
Absolutely, everyone listening, go to the show notes. You'll find links to Mr. Barnett's article and the documentaries that we talked about, as well as a few other notes. So, hey, James, I really appreciate you this morning.
Thanks so much, Jody. Appreciate you having me on today.
Thanks so much.